I want to begin with a joke. There were 4 engineers sitting in a bar discussing the subject of God. And the first engineer said, I have been looking at the genome and I have concluded that God is a genetic engineer like me. And the second one said, I've been looking at the skeleton and I've concluded that God is a mechanical engineer like me. And the third one said, I've been looking at the brain and it's clear that God is an electrical engineer like me. And the fourth one said, I'm a civil engineer. I know that God is a civil engineer. How do I know? Because who else would put a waste disposal pipe through a recreational area? In Voltaire's novel Candide, there is a shipwreck in which Candide and Pangloss and their friend Jacques are shipwrecked in the harbour of Lisbon just before the Great Lisbon earthquake. And Jacques drowns. And Candide is upset about this, but Pangloss explains that you don't need to be upset because Lisbon harbour was created in order for Jacques to drown. The 1755 earthquake at Lisbon had a huge impact on Voltaire because he saw people argue that there must be a purpose in something like an earthquake. Else why would it happen? And that what the purpose must be to punish Lisbon for its sins. He wrote in his poem, was then more vice in fallen Lisbon found than Paris where voluptuous joys abound. He was attacking the philosophy of theodicy, Leibniz's idea that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. And Voltaire points out, with this satire in Candide, the kind of muddle you get into if you look for purpose in everything in the world. So why do we think there is a purpose? Because there is a pattern. And I think we've been misled into mistaking a pattern for a purpose. We don't have good words to describe how this pattern comes about. So we get into a verbal confusion trying to understand it. But it's clear that things have function in the world. It's clear that our brains are for thinking. And it's clear that there is progress. There is progress in evolution. We see larger and larger animals and more complicated structures appearing on the Earth. It gets set back by disasters, but then again you get a gradual incremental improvement in the way that life operates, and so that a creature would defeat its ancestor of 1 million years before. And you see the same in economics. You see the same in human society. We are experiencing progress. Technology is advancing. In my lifetime, smallpox has been extinguished, and the cell phone has been invented. In my lifetime, the living standard of the average person on the planet has trebled, the income of that person. Child mortality is down by 2/3. So there is an arrow, there is a direction, but there is not a destination, because these directions could go in almost any direction. You could throw them off into any way. And how does this come about? Well, it comes about through a bottom-up process. It's not a top-down process. We've made that discovery. Adam Smith and Charles Darwin and people like that stumbled upon this idea at the end of the Enlightenment, that it is possible to have order without ordaining it, that it is possible to have, in a phrase, emergent order. And it's one of the most beautiful ideas that human beings have ever come up with. And just as we embrace the idea that we can have an ordered society without having an absolute monarchy, that democracy can work. We didn't used to think that in the 17th century. We do think that now. So I think we should learn to embrace the idea of emergent order rather than top-down design. The idea that as people interact together and as life interacts, as genes interact, you can get patterns emerging which are fascinating and which solve problems and which produce functional order and symmetry and beauty and all these other wonderful things we see in the world. But there is nobody in charge of the process, and there is no destination. It's a wonderful journey, and we don't know where it'll take us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Please, William, it's your turn. 6 minutes.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in this debate on one of life's most important questions. Does the universe have a purpose? And in today's debate, we on the affirmative side are going to defend two main contentions. First, that if God does not exist, then the universe has no purpose. And secondly, if God does exist, then the universe does have a purpose. Let me say a word in defense of each of those contentions. First, if God does not exist, then both man and the universe are inevitably doomed to death. Man, like all biological organisms, must die. And the universe, too, faces a death of its own. Astronomers tell us that the universe is expanding, and as it does so, it grows colder and colder as its energy is used up. Eventually, all the stars will burn out, and all matter will collapse into dead stars and black holes. There will be no light, there will be no heat, there will be no life, just the corpses of dead stars and galaxies ever expanding into the endless darkness and the cold recesses of space, a universe in ruins. This is not science fiction. As unimaginable as it may sound, barring divine intervention, this will happen. There is no escape. There is no hope. On atheism, there is no immortality beyond the grave. And what's the consequence of this? Well, as many atheist philosophers, from Nietzsche to Russell to Sartre, have recognized, it means that life itself is absurd. It means that life is without objective purpose. As Richard Dawkins has put it, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no good, no evil, nothing but pitiless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. Thus, if God does not exist, then life and the universe are without purpose. But if atheism fails to provide a purpose for life and the universe, what about biblical theism? According to the biblical worldview, God does exist and man's life does not end at the grave. The purpose of life is to be found in a personal relationship with a holy and loving God. As the Westminster Catechism asks, what is the chief end of man? To glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Biblical theism thus provides the two conditions necessary for an objectively purposeful life: God and immortality. And because of this, we can live consistently and purposefully within the framework of such a worldview. And thus, biblical theism succeeds precisely where atheism breaks down. Now, I'd be the first to say that none of this proves that God exists. But in today's debate, we've been asked to discuss not whether God exists, but whether the universe has a purpose. And the answer to that question is, it all depends. If God does not exist, then the universe has no purpose. If God does exist, then the universe has a purpose. On this question, there need be no dispute between the theist and the atheist. I think we can all agree with those two contentions as I've stated them. Now, if our colleagues on the other side want to go beyond this merely conditional statement and claim that the universe in fact has no purpose, then they must prove that the antecedent of that conditional is true. That is to say, they must show that God does not exist. So what arguments did Professor Ridley give to show that God does not exist? Well, I basically heard only one, namely the problem of evil. This is not the best of all possible worlds. Well, certainly all of us need to face the problem of evil, and any account of evil must begin with this question: what is evil? I maintain that evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. I can think of no more reasonable definition of evil that captures our shared intuitions. But if we agree that there is evil in the world, and that evil is a departure from the way things ought to be, then we must also agree that there is a way things ought to be. But if there is a way things ought to be, then there must be some transcendent design plan or purpose that determines how things ought to be. And so there must be some transcendent being, a creator in fact, whose will is the basis for how things ought to be. And hence evil is actually evidence that God does exist. If atheists are right and God does not exist, then there is no design plan, hence no way things ought to be, hence no departure from the way things ought to be, and hence no evil. But does anyone here really want to claim that evil does not exist? So I don't think we've heard any good reason to think that God does not exist. Indeed, the theist is not committed to Leibniz's claim that this is the best of all possible worlds. Now, time doesn't permit me to develop in my opening statement a case for theism. Let me simply list the arguments which I have defended in my published work. Number one, God is the best explanation for why anything exists rather than nothing. 2, God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe. 3, God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe for intelligent life. 4, God is the best explanation for the existence of objective moral values and duties in the world, including evil. And 5, the very possibility of God's existence entails that God exists. If you're interested in a detailed discussion of these arguments,
Time is out, I'm sorry.
see my book, Reasonable Faith.
Thank you very much.